Hey guys, welcome to your chapter 10, 11, and 12 test review. That's going to cover Andrew Jackson, Antebellum Reform Movement, and Manifest Destiny. So these PowerPoints are available in Canvas if you need to go through them slowly. Remember, this does not take the place of anything regarding your reading, your responsibilities, and taking notes and stuff like that. This is just simply a test review. Understanding the material, of course, is important. So we're going to start with Andrew Jackson. And if you remember in class, I gave you the acronym WITCH, WITCH. That kind of tells you the major events in regarding Andrew Jackson. W being the war on the national banks, which will be on the test. The I, which is the Indians, which is the Trail of Tears, which will also be on this test. The T is the tariffs, which is the nullification crisis. Will not be on this test, but you still need to know it. At least his actions as president. The C is for common man, which you've already written on that. And then, of course, the H is for henchman or the spoil system, which you'll see some of that when we do our model Congress stuff later this week. So let's go ahead and let's get into Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian democracy. If you remember, these are the kind of the qualities that we've gone over in class. Like I said, a lot of this stuff, even though he is labeled a Democrat, he is going to be more for federal rights than state rights because of his actions as president, things like going over Supreme Court decisions and not being for the internal improvements bill. So those are things that maybe a old Federalist or a Whig might be for, not necessarily a true Jacksonian or even a Jeffersonian Democrat. If you remember, he lost in 1824 due to the corrupt bargain that Henry Clay made with John Quincy Adams, which led to a four-year kind of a battle in preparation for him becoming president in 1828. So let's jump to him as president. These are things of the second party system. So if you're a Democrat, you're for state rights, limited government, laissez-faire. You're for expansion, and that's going to go into James K. Polk as president and his vision for Manifest Destiny. On the flip side, you've got the National Republicans or the Whigs. Make sure you know who they are for your test. Henry Clay, of course, is the leader of the Whig Party. And he's known for the federal system, wants a strong federal government. They had mixed views on slavery. Remember, there was conscious Whigs and cotton Whigs, mainly from New England. But also remember that a lot of things that Jackson did as president is going to reflect what a Whig would believe in. Jackson ushered in the era of universal male suffrage, which we know was only mainly white men, but not just for property owners. And so universal male manhood suffrage was in all states by 1856. And of course, they'll carry over into after the Civil War when African Americans will get the right to vote as a result of the 15th Amendment. All right, so this is if you remember in your SAQ, this is the political cartoon that was on your SAQ. It's also going to be on your test. And so if you remember in class, remember I told you that that this is a negative perspective of Andrew Jackson, that this was probably drawn by somebody who was a supporter of the Whig Party or the National Republicans. The reason why he's dressed as a king is if you can see down here on the bottom, you can see that he's trampling on the Constitution. He's also trampling on the Internal Improvements Bill, and he's holding the power of veto. But his refusal to uphold certain Supreme Court rulings like Worcester versus Georgia or the Cherokee, really Worcester versus Georgia, kind of gives him that he's acting as a king because he's not respecting the judicial branch's decisions. So he's almost acting like a king or tyrannical in his job as president. That's why a lot of people compare him to current day Donald Trump. But he is going to use the executive authority to the highest level and even go up above the other two branches of government. All right. So you see that he used the veto 12 times, mainly for the internal improvements because he believed that states ought to be able to fund that. It shouldn't be a national funding. But when they start crossing state lines is where you start getting in trouble. And he says in this veto that he has no connection with any established system of improvements. It's exclusively within the limits of a state. rather than the federal government. All right, one of your forever dates is the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which is going to set the scene for the Cherokee Indians in Georgia, who are going to sue for their right for land. In the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, they determined that Native tribes could not could not sue because they were not citizens of the United States. But in Worcester versus Georgia, the Cherokee Nations are a sovereign tribe, and the United States could not interfere. And you know that Andrew Jackson is going to go above their head, which leads to the Trail of Tears. So this little painting down here at the bottom, if you notice, this is drawn from an American point of view. You can see all these natives that are dressed with all their blankets. Everything is collected. They're moving everything, but this isn't the case. They were not riding horses. They certainly were not allowed to hold shotguns. I don't know if you can see that image down here on the lower left. They were not allowed to bring their belongings. It was almost like a death march. And so this is going to start with the Indian Removal Act through Worcester versus Georgia. And then, of course, Andrew Jackson is going to displace these American Indians from the Southwest in Georgia and move them into current day Oklahoma and then up into the Dakotas. So make sure you know about the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, because that will be, of course, on your test. So you can kind of see how over time that we are going to continue to take land. If you remember John Green talking about taking land that was benefits us from a mineral standpoint and leaving the bad part of the land to the natives. And we'll talk more about that after after the holiday break, especially in the 1890s when the Indian Wars will begin to develop. All right. So the next thing, don't forget the nullification crisis won't be on your test, but you should know that it started with the Tariff of Abominations. South Carolina threatens to secede. This is where kind of Jackson kind of takes the side of the national government at this time, which forces John C. Calhoun to resign as vice president. Martin Van Buren becomes the vice president. That's a byproduct of the spoils system. And then, of course, South Carolina threatens to secede, which leads to the Force Bill, which allows the Andrew Jackson to send the army in to enforce the law. And of course, we come to a compromise. All right. The bank war will be on your test. Remember that Andrew Jackson is going to despise the bank because it was a symbol of the wealthy and the elite, and so he wanted to do away with it. He blamed the Bank of the United States for the Panic of 1819. When the recharter of the bill came up in 1832, Nicholas Biddle, along with Henry Clay, is going to pressure Jackson into trying to pass the bank, to which Jackson is not going to do that. And he ends up vetoing the charter. So remember, this goes along the same lines of what the nation's or the national government, what their role is in the bank. And you can see that Andrew Jackson is going to take upon, use his power as president and the executive authority to shut down the bank. So another example of federal rights versus state rights. In this case, Andrew Jackson waving the strong hammer for the national rights. And so this is similar. This is no different. If you remember his beliefs, moving the Native Americans, using his executive power, closing the bank down, using his executive power, vetoing internal improvements, using his executive power. You can see that all these are examples of him using the authority of the presidency to the fullest. All right. And I think that is all when it comes to Andrew Jackson. He gets reelected. More debate about whether or not the bank should have been shut down or not, but we end up doing that, and that leads to the Panic of 1837. And of course, Martin Van Buren, or as most people call it, Martin Van Ruin, is going to take the blame for the bank, which leads to our first Whig president, and that's William Henry Harrison, who was the only president for 30 days because he caught pneumonia and died. All right, so for antebellum reform, there's going to be a lot of questions over the issue of slavery. All right, so let's talk about slavery for a minute. We know I went too far. We know that the North is going to be economically developed because of the manufacturing industry. We know the South is going to be primarily agricultural. And you can see, and we talked about this in class, how the South is going to rely on cotton for most of their economy. And then in the South, we know that there's a kind of a social hierarchy goes on, where the slave system or the slaves are at the bottom of the social hierarchy system. So if you're a poor white, you still have that feeling of social superiority over any free or enslaved African Americans, where African Americans still held a little power. So even if you were a poor white farmer, you still felt like you had some sort of power because you had more power than either a free African American or a African American slave. Nonetheless, the immorality that comes up, and let me flip. There should be a talks about kind of the morality part of it. Perhaps not. I thought it did. All right. So understand that this issue of slavery is going to. Oh, here it is, right here. For the argument is that slavery is considered a sin and a violation of natural rights, and what this causes is this causes an immorality complex that's going to be widespread in the South. And we talk about, where are the roots of racism that's developed in the South, and you still see it today, especially highlighted on social media and stuff. And it still comes down to the Southern culture, going back to during the 1800s with the issue of slavery, right? Because it's considered a sin and immoral, slavery has that widespread corrupting effect on the Southern culture. It's always that racism is always something that kind of hangs in the balance. Is one of those continuities in our history. We've talked about that in class, and so we know that as slave rebellions occur, or they develop their own culture, like they were anti-literate because they weren't allowed to get an education because they felt like or plantation owners or whites felt like a educated slave was a dangerous slave because they could plan rebellions. And so there was additional restrictions that were placed. There were slave codes that were placed on slaves, that they couldn't gather, they couldn't meet, they could not hold Bible studies, and things like that, in the fear that rebellions were going to happen. And rebellions did happen. Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner's revolt. Harriet Jacobs will be on this test referring to Nat Turner's insurrection and the rebellion. And so if you remember in your antebellum speed dating, you should have met Harriet Jacobs. So make sure you know who she is, as part of a abolitionist movement. All right. So let me see where I'm going from here. I'm kind of flipping through the tests as I go through your review here. So finding me number 5. All right. And so continuing on with kind of the lines being drawn, we know that William Lloyd Garrison is a abolitionist. We know that Frederick Douglass is an escaped slave, self-educated, who is obviously anti-slavery member of the Liberty Party. And then on the flip side, you got John C. Calhoun, who's going to argue that slavery was a good thing. And then, of course, James Henry Hammond, which you're going to see an excerpt on about him, using him on the test. And so when it comes to John C. Calhoun, some things you just need to know. Southern landowners, obviously, being plantation owners, are gonna agree with John C. Calhoun's idea that it's better to be a slave working out in the open fields in the open air, with all your food and clothing provided, as compared to the factory worker who makes no money, works inside all day, can get cut up or get a arm or a limb sliced off and could be unemployed at any moment. We know that as a result of the slave institution, we know that slaves are going to engage in forms of resistance to slavery, things like working slower than they have to, sabotaging equipment, and other things, running away and things like that to sabotage it. And all this is doing is this is creating and this is one of the overriding themes of the test, is that as the North and the South develop, they're going to develop into distinct societies, and they're going to differ on the issue of slavery. And there's going to involve this indifference, or this difference, that's going to lead to tension, that's going to lead to the Civil War. And that's where we're heading towards. Of course, the major publications by William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, the North Star by Douglass, and the Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, so jumping to this one here on hold on a sec, for the this speech by John C. Calhoun. This is actually going to be on your test. I gotta find it in here. Oh, here it is. All right. So in dealing with this, and I'm going to kind of point to it here. Starting kind of right here, this section here is going to be on your test as one of your sections. Obviously, not all of this. That's a little bit too long, but a couple things that you need to be able to pull from this speech is obviously John C. Calhoun is a proponent of state rights. He's a proponent of slaveries. He believes that slave owners have become reliant on the slave system, and that it was essential to protect their economy and their way of life. Attitude on the both sides of the slavery argument hardened so that there was no political compromise. So as you get into the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, slave owners are going to be so hell bent on keeping the slave institution is that they're not going to be willing to compromise on the issue of slavery, and that's only going to lead to more tension. That, and I've already mentioned slave rebellions, they're going to occur in places like Haiti, they're going to occur in South Carolina, they're going to occur in Virginia. And so obviously this is going to lead to slave codes. And I've already kind of mentioned that, but that's kind of re-emphasized on the test right here. All right. So, I think that's all on the slave issue. Oh, here is James Henry Hammond. He will be on the test as well. Remember that we're trying to justify slavery as a positive good. When you see this, remember that the anti-abolitionist movement is a byproduct of the Second Great Awakening, and that's all the antebellum reform we're going to talk about here in a minute about temperance and transcendentalism, utopian societies, Mormons, prison reform, education, all falls under the Second Great Awakening. And if you are, somebody who is a proponent of Frederick Douglass, and I'm pretty sure you already know this, but that Frederick Douglass was an advocate of an abolitionist, right? And was when he escaped to the North, he, like I said, became part of the Liberty Party. So make sure obviously, that he's for the North, right? All right, here are the examples of slave resistance, like faking illness, stealing, breaking tools, slow down, sabotage, negotiating labor times and tasks, escaping. And so as a result of that, slave resistance and revolts, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner's rebellion, the Amistad, which was actually a success, and that inspired abolition. And you see the slave population grow here. And I think I showed this to you in class, so this will be rather familiar to you. And the number of free blacks that obviously are going to move to the north. All right. And then, so as you're starting to head west, you see the difference between free and slave states early on in our history. And you can see in 1800, then 1821. And then as we're talking about manifest destiny and such, you can see how as we push west, that slavery is going to become the overriding issue. And of course, it's going to lead to the Civil War. So, we still got a lot to talk about as far as the development of the West, but you can kind of see how it kind of breaks down leading to 1861 and where were our free states and slave states. Okay. All right, so we're gonna jump past this. All right, let's jump to women's rights. All right, and if you remember from your speed dating, you should have met like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and the Seneca Falls Convention. And at the Seneca Falls Convention, they're basically going to write a Declaration of Independence for women. And so you can see that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and the establishment over an absolute tyranny over her. Right. And so these, obviously, this is rhetoric from the Declaration of Independence. And if you remember, women were also members of the abolitionist movement because they felt that if African Americans got the right to vote, then women would get the right to vote. And so you're seeing the beginnings of the stirring of women's rights. All right. I don't think there's anything on immigration. But of course, you do need to know that going forward as far as your AP test is concerned, especially in regards to the Nativist Party with the Irish and the Germans coming in. Here's the American Party flag, or the Native American Party, or the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, or the Know Nothing Party. All right, more on reform. Or we know that this is all born of the Second Great Awakening, led by Charles Finney. Believed in Protestant revivalism. So this is a Protestant movement, very emotional, believed in perfectionism, a lot of millennialism going on, and the rejection of Enlightenment principles. Like I said, led by Charles Finney. You kind of see the growth. Started in the western part of New York, and then begins spreading to the West because of the transportation revolution and Manifest Destiny, people spreading ideas as well. The Benevolent Empire, of course, is talking about religious commitment to social reform, turning away from immoral values. The Utopians are part of the reform movement. Brook Farm, Robert Owen's New Harmony, the Shakers, and the Oneida community. You should have met those people in the speed dating. All right, and then there's going to be some stuff on transcendentalism. All right, so they believe in following their inner light, which is their intuition, almost like their conscience. Emphasis on emotionalism and feeling. They believed on being self-reliant and independent. They believed that if the government was wrong, then they didn't have to follow the law. So, for example, like Henry David Thoreau refusing to pay taxes during the Mexican-American War is an example of that. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Cesar Chavez, they're all going to follow the same action of passive resistance, right? Born out of the Transcendentalist movement. So when it comes to, there's going to be some stuff from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote the book, The American Scholar in 1837. And this was basically, if you look here, it says, despite cultural heritage, instinctive creative genius of mind could lead to greatness. Man thinking not should be subdued by his instruments. Books are for the scholar's idle times. And when he can read God directly, the hour is too precious to be wasted, and the men's transcripts are reading. And so he is going to encourage the expansion of participating in the democracy in the progressive era. That's the 1900 to the 1920s, and then the emergence of a national culture based on ideas such as this. Especially in the early 18th century, where we start identifying our own culture, and of course, part of that spiritual movement is going to lead to transcendentalism, along with the other ones. Henry David Thoreau was kind of his right-hand man, his not apprentice, but kind of he mentored Henry David Thoreau, who wrote the book. It's a famous book on civil disobedience, which opened the door for passive resistance. You'll see some stuff on the temperance movement. We know that people are going to do all kinds of studies on the effects of drunkenness, whether it's domestic violence or on the job drinking, and how it turns into accidents and stuff like that. We know that alcohol consumption can damage people's physical and emotional well-being. We know that that people want to be held to a high moral and religious ground. So there is a movement to get rid of alcohol, and that will actually succeed in 1921, I think, with the passing of the 18th Amendment. And then, of course, they take it back in the 1930s. Did I say 18? I meant 1920s, and then taken back in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. But you may see this you're not going to see the political cartoon on the test, but you'll definitely may see this at some point in the future on an AP test, or even on a final exam or something like that. So it's one of those political cartoons that that's out there a lot. All right. So next we're going to go to, looks like we're heading towards Manifest Destiny. So as you look at like Dorothea Dix, and the one before that was Horace Mann and the Education. Of course, you got theater that was going on, which would be considered highly racist today. Romanticism. This is a picture of the Hudson River School. You can see perfect nature, where people are in nature, and then over time it develops into a society, and then a tear down of society. I wish we'd spend more time talking about that. But American agriculture, taken from ancient Greece. Here's some examples of some literature that came up after the War of 1812. Remember, I told you American writers. Well, here's some examples of some narratives that you might be reading at some point in AP Lang. All right, so let's get into Antebellum. So Alexis de Tocqueville is a Frenchman that comes over to America and kind of witnesses the hustle and bustle of America, and ends up writing a book called Democracy of America. And it really kind of lays out our identity as Americans, that people can rise up from the ashes to hold jobs, to own land, to making money. There's also the opportunity of equality, which I know a lot of people would still argue that equality is one of those things that's out there that people are chasing but can't quite obtain for all kinds of reasons. But we need to spend more time talking about this book because it really lays out our identity as Americans. For our test, Make sure you know that the word manifest destiny was taken from a guy by the name of John L. Sullivan in a magazine called the Demographic Review. And so just some things about what he said in 1845. Obviously, that the concepts of our Republican democracy is found in the Declaration of Independence, that God has given us the right to explore, overspread, and to possess the whole entire continent, which Providence, which is God, has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty. And this is going to lead us to the desire to gain more possession overseas. And so when we get into imperialism in the 1900s, this is an extension of manifest destiny. So you're going to be asked about that on the test. Is manifest destiny taken worldwide? And that's imperialism. Also, we know that with the gaining of land, we know that the issue of slavery is going to rear its ugly head time and time again. All right. And so, when you think about, how our nation's put together, make sure you know about, Louisiana Purchase in 1809, Texas, which was annexed in 1845, the Oregon Territory, which was brought in 1846 in an agreement with Great Britain. We're going to go to war with Mexico in 1846 and sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and acquire California and the Mexican Cession in 1848. And then we're going to get the small tract of land on the southern part of Arizona. And that's part called the Gadsden Purchase. Now, what gives us the justification for doing this? And it's the belief in white cultural and political superiority. We're going to, think about people that we're going to push west. We're going to push, and I don't know if there's any slides on this. Oh, we'll get to this in a minute. We're pushing the natives to the west. We're pushing, we're extending slavery out west because of farming. And so this is really a political, white cultural and political superiority. We know that as we push west, there's going to be increasing division between the North and the South because of slavery. All right. And then of course, the American Progress painting by John Gass, drawn in 1872, that displays manifest destiny as a belief that the movement west was a natural fulfillment of progress by the United States. And this Western progression, in this picture, you can see the railroads, you can see the carriages, you can see the Constago wagons, you can see the Pony Express, you can see settlers moving to the west, the pioneers. All those are ways that people are moving west, but mainly the railroads, the stagecoach, and the covered wagon. We've already talked about racial superiority and cultural superiority, so if I'm saying it 3 or 4 times, it's going to be on a test. And then, of course, the controversy over allowing and forbidding slavery in the new acquired territories, and we've already talked about that. So we're getting here towards the end. So just some other things. Second party system. You should know the difference between a Democrat and a Whig. And we'll talk about that with our model Congress. Oh, here's a famous portrait of Henry Clay, your boy, the great compromiser, Missouri Compromise of 1850, the nullification crisis, how he came to a compromise with the tariff. And then, of course, Roger Taney is a byproduct of the spoils system. He comes in as the Secretary of Treasury, and then he'll be named to the Supreme Court. He'll become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And this court case down here, Scott versus Sanford, Dred Scott versus Sanford, is going to blow things out of the water when he says that you can take your slaves anywhere in America. It doesn't matter if it's free or slave territory. William Henry Harrison gets elected in 1840. He's the first Whig president. Dies after 30 days in office. So he's not there very long. John Tyler was really a Democrat in Whig's clothing. We know that we'll obtain Texas through the Texas Revolution. James K. Polk is kind of the poster boy for Manifest Destiny, and he will go to war with Mexico, which we'll talk about in class. Threatens to go to war with Britain over the Oregon Territory. And of course, we go to war with Mexico as part of the spot resolutions, which says this disputed territory where bloodshed was spilt by the Mexicans. And of course, America is going to take exception to that and declare war, which of course leads to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Wilmot Proviso was an idea that said that why don't we just take the Missouri Compromise line? Oh, no. That Wilmot Proviso, what they were going to do was going to ban slavery in all land gained by from Mexico. Gadsden, not the Gadsden Purchase, the Mexican Cession, and people are going to say it was defeated in the Senate, passed in the House, defeated in the Senate. and this is going to be further the tension between the North and the South. Let's see here. Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo. We'll gain the Mexican territory, and that's the end. All right. So if you've got any questions regarding the test, please let me know, and best of luck.